5 o'clock. PM. Valerie Singleton and Robert Williams.
And in today's PM, are bank interest rates about to go up? Yes, probably, says a city expert. And if they do, will mortgage interest rates go up too? Yes, certainly, says the Building Societies Association. An official report out today says that 10% of patients admitted to hospital without any infection contract an infection of some kind, including food poisoning, during their stay. And we celebrate with a bottle of Bombay Bubbly, the arrival of a sparkling wine from India. But first we have a summary of the news from Eugene Fraser.
The food poisoning outbreak, which killed 19 people at the Stanley Royd Hospital at Wakefield in West Yorkshire 18 months ago, has been blamed on a failure to observe basic rules of hygiene. The report of the public inquiry says the kitchen wasn't kept clean and was infested with cockroaches. It blames senior management for poor supervision. The government has now announced that there's to be an inquiry into the role of the public health doctors. The pharmaceutical and food products group Glaxo has decided to put its troubled Farley Health Products subsidiary into liquidation. The company was forced to withdraw its infant milk food products from the market last December after suggestions that they'd been the source of salmonella food poisoning. More than 20 people are reported to have died in a big car bomb explosion in Beirut, in what looks like the latest episode in the continuing hostility between rival Christian factions. About 100 people were injured in the blast. A French cargo ship is trying to rescue up to 400 people in South Yemen, 23 of them British. Spasmodic fighting is apparently still going on around the capital, Aden. A BBC committee has drawn up a plan for tackling the question of violence on television. An outside academic is to carry out research on programs on all 4 channels, and producers will debate the issues in a series of seminars. The French aircraft company Aerospatiale, the joint makers of Concorde with British Aerospace, say a new version of the plane is on the cards within 10 years. They say it should be quieter, more economical, and be able to carry twice as many passengers. But American money would be needed to develop it. The news, and now, attention all shipping. The Met Office issued the following gale warning to shipping at 1600 GMT today, Tuesday the 21st of January. Dover, White, Biscay, Fastnet. Gale now ceased, but southwest gale, force 8, expected soon. Portland, Plymouth, Lundy, Irish Sea, southwest gale, force 8, expected soon. Malin, Hebrides, gale, force 8, backing southerly soon.
Thank you, Eugene. A possible further rise in interest rates, which was staved off at the last moment this morning by the intervention of the Bank of England, was one of the topics raised this afternoon in the House of Commons at Prime Minister's questions. It provoked a clash between the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, Neil Kinnock. From Westminster, here's one of our political correspondents, David Koss.
The Labour leader Neil Kinnock warned that another rise in interest rates would be an extra burden on British industrialists who were doing their best to compete overseas. Well, Mrs Thatcher rejected his demand that she should do all in her power to prevent a further increase, but she was clearly far from happy.
Obviously, the government does not like increases in interest rates, but it is bound, in fact, to take action to ensure that keeping down inflation remains our top priority. The markets this week have been unsettled by the fall that has occurred in the oil price, but the Bank of England have maintained their dealing rates.
Which wasn't enough for Mr Kinnock.
Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister must be the only person left who believes that she can fight inflation by pushing up interest rates and by imposing the nutcracker on British industry of domestically high interest rates and a high exchange rate? What's the British Prime Minister got against British industry?
A question asked only slightly less politely by Sir Peter Tapsell, a Conservative stockbroker and banking expert who once upon a time used to speak for the Conservative Party on economic matters.
Right honourable friend, think that it is right or sensible that men and women running small businesses in this country should have to pay about 16% to borrow money when there are over 3 million unemployed and enormous unused resources? Will she bear this in mind as the clamour rises for even higher interest rates?
Interest rates, said Mrs Thatcher, were partly affected by the commercial judgment of the banks, an answer which drew hoots of incredulity from the Labour benches.
David Koss reporting from Westminster. We've since heard that the Speaker of the House of Commons has turned down an opposition request for an emergency debate this afternoon on interest rates. You may recall that when the bank interest rates went up last 2 weeks ago, the building society said they'd received such an inflow of funds that they didn't need immediately to raise their mortgage rates. But what would be the position if bank rate does go up later this week? Here's Roy Cox of Nationwide, the chairman of the Building Societies Association.
If the banks raise their rates, as I say, we don't know for how much they'll raise them, but probably 1%, then I think it's probably inevitable that building societies will have to raise their mortgage rates. And of course, to raise the rates paid to investors. You see, we've got already a 1% increase a week or so ago, and that would make a 2%. I wouldn't like to say what individual building societies would decide to put their rates up by, but it will be a reasonable amount.
Roy Cox, the chairman of the Building Societies Association. Well, the stockbrokers Phillips and Drew are predicting that despite the Bank of England's move, interest rates will go up 1.5% tomorrow. John Silverman went to speak to their chief economist, Stephen Lewis.
Yes, I think it's likely, with money rates pointing to at least a 1 percentage point increase in base rates, that those rates will now increase. The authorities are likely to allow the rates to go up as part of their policy of protecting sterling.
The 7-day arrangement that the bank entered into to intervene to keep the rate down comes to an end tomorrow, so can we expect the rate to go up then?
I think they may wait for a day or two just to see if sterling recovers of its own accord. But if sterling remains fairly soft, as it is likely to if oil prices stay weak, then I think that interest rates will have to go up.
Surely the Bank of England was signalling that it didn't want rates to go up.
That was last week. Since then, we've seen a very sharp fall in the oil price. Economic circumstances have therefore changed, and I think the authorities would be willing to see interest rates move a little higher in the hope that they could keep sterling stable at levels fairly close to those now prevailing.
There was a story circulating that the Bank of England was no longer going to intervene to try to keep sterling on a level to prop it up.
Well, I think if the oil price did continue to fall to well below $20 a barrel, then the authorities would give up on this policy of raising interest rates to protect the pound. But I think they may well give it one more go. They will hope that if they raise interest rates, this will stabilize the pound, and then as oil prices recover after the OPEC Market Monitoring Committee early in February, there will be a benefit in terms of recovery in sterling, which will then enable them slowly to roll back the interest rate increase during March and April.
Well, in March, of course, the Chancellor presents his budget. It can't be particularly good news for him to be faced now with higher interest rates.
Well, he must be worrying now about what size of fiscal adjustment, that is, scope for tax cuts, he has available. If the oil price stays at this level, he may well conclude there's very little room for cutting taxes in the budget, so he, more than anyone, must be hoping for a rebound in the oil price, which would enable him to deliver cuts to the taxpayer.
Do you foresee any other change in the interest rate before the budget, either up or down?
It is possible, if oil prices recover from their present oversold position, that we shall get a small cut in interest rates ahead of the budget. But after the next rise in rates, it seems very unlikely that we shall see further increases in rates on top of that.
The chief economist at stockbrokers Phillips and Drew, Stephen Lewis, talking to John Silverman.
At lunchtime today, a number of British wine writers gathered with several other experts in the same field for what they all thought would be a rather novel experience, the first tasting in this country of a sparkling wine from India. But I must say, as they went into the London hotel where the Bombay bubbly was being served at a private tasting, there was a definite air of scepticism in the air. But to find out more about this new phenomenon, Carol West joined the team.
The man behind the new venture is self-made millionaire Shyam Shaguli. His business group has interests in construction, hotels, shipping and helicopters. So why not sparkling wine, thought this versatile entrepreneur.
Every time I used to go to France, we used to drink champagne, either to celebrate the contracts that we signed or to celebrate somebody's birthdays or some parties. This is such a fine drink which is made out of grapes, and we have plenty of grapes in India. Why not I try to make champagne in India? And that's the reason I started talking to various French champagne houses. But nobody was prepared to talk to me because I used to use the word champagne. They said, no, champagne cannot be made anywhere else except in Champagne Distillery of France.
But a small thing like EEC law was not going to daunt Mr. Shagouli, who started off as a salesman in Bombay with only 50 rupees and a small suitcase. He enlisted the help of a team of French experts and invested £4 million in a vineyard and equipment in Maharashtra state.
They said, if you want to have exactly similar to champagne, you may have to import some of the grapes from Champagne Distillery of France to blend with Indian grapes in order to give a flavor which is exactly identical to Champagne Distillery. I said, okay, fine. Grape cuttings we brought. We cultivated them in Indian soil, which is eventually happened to be exactly identical to the Champagne Distillery of France. Somebody jokingly said that you have imported not only technology, not only a plant, but you imported Champagne district into India, because the soil is exactly identical to Champagne district.
One of his original advisors, French winemaster Raphael Bribois, now works permanently at the wine-producing plant 100 miles outside Bombay. He prefers to think he has a unique product and avoids comparisons with the sparkling wines of Europe.
I don't think comparison must be made because it is an original product from India, and I think we have our own characteristic. And why comparing two things which are not comparable? I think 80% of people will not believe we are making wine in India. So, okay, let them taste. I think there will be big surprise, but then they will say, maybe India is not so bad.
The wine certainly flowed in abundance at the tasting, and when the wine writers had had a chance to imbibe a glass or two, I asked some of them for their views.
I think it's remarkably good, considering it's a new setup. The vines are still young, and you know, they haven't made the mistakes that beginners usually make. They're making a very good wine indeed.
It's certainly not champagne, but it's a very nice, light, refreshing wine. They've said it'd be very good with curry, and I think they're probably right, and it would cut through the richness of the food.
The competition for sparkling wines in this country is enormous, so that you can get perfectly decent champagne from the supermarkets and from the wine houses for under the £7 that this will cost. But I think it's going to be a weapon to Indian restaurants who normally just sell lager, that they're going to be selling a lot of this, quite rightly, because as I say, next time I have a tandoori, I shall ask for this, providing they don't put too much of a markup on it.
That report was from Carol West.
Last month at the Luxembourg summit, the EEC heads negotiated a package of reforms to the Treaty of Rome that would speed up the workings of the community and give the European Parliament greater powers. Today, the Danish Parliament vote on whether or not to accept those reforms. If the vote goes against the new package and the minority coalition government is expected to be voted down, then there will be a referendum in Denmark. Our Europe correspondent Stephen Jessel told me why the reforms were unlikely to receive a favourable vote.
Well, there are two objections, really. One is that the Danes are very unhappy about giving the European Parliament any more authority than it already has. The reforms agreed at Luxembourg were pretty modest, but they're clearly too much for the Danes, who are very sensitive about matters of national sovereignty.
Why is that?
They've always been split, the Danes, whether they should look north to their fellow Nordic countries, Norway and Sweden, or whether they should look south to West Germany, France, and the other side, west to Britain. There is a certain history of neutrality, too, of staying out of other people's arguments, and therefore the idea that they should surrender some of their sovereignty, only a tiny bit, one has to say, to Strasbourg, is very difficult for many of them to accept. Then there's a further point about giving up some power to majority voting. The Danes have very high standards in certain areas, environmental, pollution and so forth, and they're a little worried about they might have to give up those standards if their other more powerful neighbours decided to vote them down. So those two factors do strike a certain chord in Denmark.
Now, the minority coalition government are presumably for the reforms.
Yes, they are. Mr. Schluter, the Prime Minister, was at the Luxembourg meeting, and although he couldn't go along with everything, he certainly, I think, agreed to recommend it to his Parliament.
So who will be voting against it?
Well, Mr. Schluter heads a minority government, and there are enough smaller parties, and indeed the large Social Democratic Party, who to some extent appear to be trying to make political capital out of it. But it does appear at the moment that Mr. Schluter, the Prime Minister, will not have enough votes to get this through the Danish Parliament, the Volketing.
Now, if the reforms are turned down, they're going to put it to the country in a referendum. Is that normal procedure in Denmark?
No, Schluter appears to have decided to appeal over the heads of the Parliament, if you like, or the opposition anyway, to the Danish people themselves. Now, this could be a risky tactic if the Danes turn down the package in a referendum, then that I think would really open up the whole question of whether the Danes really want to belong to the common market. The British are not the only unenthusiastic marketeers in Europe by any means. But the evidence is that the Danes have done very well out of the common market, out of membership, and although they do have reservations, there will probably be enough steam to get a yes vote in the referendum.
Our Europe correspondent, Stephen Jessel.
It's coming up to 16 minutes past 5. Time for another look at the main headlines. The food poisoning outbreak, which led to the death of 19 people at the Stanley Royd Hospital in Wakefield 18 months ago, has been blamed on poor hygiene in the kitchens. A report says the kitchen wasn't kept clean and was infested with cockroaches. The Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, has said the Royal Yacht Britannia will stay off the coast of South Yemen as long as she's needed. Britannia rescued another 15 Britons from Aden this morning. And as we've heard, the pound has continued to fall on the foreign exchanges. There could still be a rise in interest rates this week.
In the Lebanon, there's been another massive car bomb blast in a Christian district of East Beirut, with many people thought to have been killed and injured. Our correspondent Gerald Butt, who's in Nicosia, told me what was known about the explosion.
It seems that about midday local time in East Beirut, the Christian half of the city, a car bomb with a very large amount of explosives, something like 550 pounds of explosives, detonated in a narrow and rather busy shopping street, and naturally it caused absolutely massive devastation. It gouged a huge hole in the road, set fire to a number of buildings round about, and as rescue workers came to the scene, they had a lot of difficulty getting to those trapped inside the buildings, partly because of the smoke, partly because of the rubble and so on, but also because a number of major electricity cables had been snapped by the explosion, and they had to wait until the Central Electricity Authority had turned off the power. So it was a little while before the rescue operation could get underway.
Do they have any idea yet just how many people were killed and how many were injured?
It's difficult to say for certain at the moment, but radio reports are talking in terms of between 20 and 30 people known to have been killed so far. That figure is likely to rise during the evening and possibly even tomorrow as the rescue work continues. As far as injured are concerned, initial reports talked about 50 to 70. Now, over the last half hour or so, Christian radio stations are talking about that figure going over the 100 mark. So once again, it'll be a long time, I think, before we know the exact casualty figures, but it was a big bomb in a rather enclosed space, so I think one has to expect that the final casualty figure will be extremely high.
Now, who is likely to have been responsible for this, Gerald? I mean, has anybody yet claimed that responsibility?
Nobody has claimed responsibility. All one can say is that it comes in the context of a very bitter feud within the Christian community, particularly in East Beirut. Now, this feud has come about because of a Syrian-brokered peace plan that was signed in Damascus a few weeks ago by two Muslim militia leaders and also by the main Christian militia leader. The signing of this agreement has a major implication for the Christians in Lebanon. It means, in effect, that they would have to give up a good deal of the power that they've traditionally enjoyed. It also would mean that the Syrians would play a much bigger role in the day-to-day running of Lebanon. And the agreement was met with massive opposition within the Christian community. And indeed, the fighting that's been taking place in Christian areas over the past week or two, it's left about 200, maybe 250 people dead. This fighting has been sparked off by this agreement, and indeed the opposition has been so great that the militia leader from the Christian side who went to Damascus to sign the agreement has been forced to flee the country. So that agreement now is in tatters.
Our correspondent in Nicosia, Gerald Butt.
The BBC committee looking into violence on television has drawn up a 3-point plan to help in its review, and this includes the appointment of an outside academic to conduct research on television output over all 4 channels for 4 weeks. And already, as a result of the BBC Director General's requests for comments from the public on the portrayal of violence on television programmes, 2,500 letters have been received, most of them making only general criticism. Our arts correspondent, John Parry, asked the chairman of the committee, Mr. Will Wyatt, the BBC's head of documentary features, about the others.
They're letters which state in one way or another generally that there is too much violence on television or people do not like it, rather than mentioning particular programmes.
What about the other letters, 700 other letters that presumably were specific then? What were they specific about?
American films, drama sort of across the board, homemade drama, some of the stronger children's programmes, the news, very few letters about EastEnders or Bergerac, are sort of two important homemade things, and quite a few letters actually about ITV series.
Presumably some of these letters and phone calls are going to continue coming in, but in the meantime you're taking various steps. You're going to appoint an academic to do a review of violence on television. He's going to watch television for a month, if I understand it correctly. Doesn't it be a very long period?
Well, if one can get a detailed analysis of what kinds of things are included in programmes across all 4 channels for 2 periods of 2 weeks each, it may not be a very long period given that television's on the year round, but it will give quite a detailed picture and a factual picture of what sort of incidents turn up and in what sort of context. The trouble at the moment is most of what people say and feel about violence on television is anecdotal or impressionistic, and what we want to get is some kind of picture which puts it in the context of television as a whole.
But at the end of this examination that this so far unnamed academic is going to produce, what happens to his report?
This is something we can repeat at intervals in the future, and it does give us a starting point or benchmark, if you like, in which allows us to use the same techniques again in, say, a couple of years or whenever's time.